This is the fourth video in a series. In the first video, I suggested that there are two global religious trends. On the one hand, there is an explicit movement towards spirituality without content. On the other hand, the global spread of technology is leading to an implicit concept of God. In this video, we will look at the thinking behind the movement towards spirituality without content. The next video will examine God's response towards this movement by looking at Revelation 10 through 20. A much more detailed look at the book of Revelation can be found on the website mentalsymmetry.com. We will begin by looking at overgeneralization. Linguists have noticed that children have a natural tendency to overgeneralize rules of grammar when learning to speak. For instance, the general rule for forming the past tense in English is to add ed to a verb. Thus, the past tense of put should be putted. Notice in the cartoon how the child overgeneralizes the verb put by saying, "I putted the plate on the table." When corrected, the child misinterprets the correction and repeats saying putted, telling us that the child is not just making a mistake, but rather using a natural form of thinking. However, the child will eventually learn that there are exceptions to the rule and that the past tense of put is not putted, but rather put. Notice the progression. First, the rule is overgeneralized, and then exceptions to the rule are learned. Theories come first, and then these theories are limited by facts. First, the child comes up with a general theory of adding ed, and then the child learns that there are exceptions to the theory. Overgeneralization is not just limited to childish grammar. It is natural to make overgeneralizations about situations, people, and cultures. For instance, in this cartoon, an overgeneralization is being made about girls. As the boy climbs a tree, he thinks, "Girls don't climb trees." This is not just a specific thought about Jane, the girl who lives next door, but rather a universal statement that applies to all girls. But when the boy climbs to the top of the tree, he finds a girl sitting on a branch. This provides a counterexample that forces him to limit the extent of his overgeneralization. The exclamation mark suggests that one is not just dealing with a logical error, but rather with a way of thinking that affects the emotions. Saying this more generally, I suggest that overgeneralization feels good. Using the language of mental symmetry, there are two kinds of emotion. We are all familiar with mercy thought, which attaches emotional labels to experiences. Teacher emotion, in contrast, is related to order within complexity. Teacher thought feels good when many situations can be described by a simple statement. Therefore, teacher thought will naturally try to describe a situation in the most general terms. As a result, overgeneralization is characterized by words such as "it always" or "I never." One can see this emotional interplay in the cartoon of the girl tripping. Having the ice cream from a delicious cone fall to the ground is an experience that will be labeled as unpleasant by mercy thought, as indicated by the tear on the girl's cheek. This mercy pain can be balanced by the teacher pleasure of coming up with an overgeneralized statement. Therefore, instead of focusing upon the specific situation, the girl overgeneralizes by making a universal statement. "I can never catch a break." This type of leap from specific to universal is characteristic of overgeneralization because a specific experience is being transformed into a universal principle. In this case, the specific experience of losing the ice cream is being transformed into a universal principle of "I can never catch a break." Facts are the enemy of overgeneralization because facts limit the extent of overgeneralization. The person who is making a sweeping statement such as, "I can never catch a break," does not want to hear someone interrupting with a contradictory fact such as, "But you just received a promotion at work." Overgeneralization occurs naturally when factual knowledge is limited. For instance, the childish mind overgeneralizes about grammar because the child does not know many facts about words. Overgeneralization has theological implications. I suggested in the first video that a concept of God emerges when a sufficiently general theory applies to personal identity. And we just saw that overgeneralization typically starts from a personal experience and then jumps to a universal theory. This means that overgeneralization naturally leads to a concept of God. I mentioned that teacher thought feels good when many specific situations can be summarized by a simple universal statement. The simplest possible universal statement is that all is one, because this is in 3 short words that everything fits together. This is the ultimate overgeneralization, because one is jumping directly from specific experience to literally everything. Notice in the illustration how overgeneralization is being used to jump from 10 different religions to a simple statement about the universal light. Notice also that this overgeneralization ignores all of the specific facts that distinguish these various religions from one another. Moving further, the easiest way to apply something to personal identity is by emotionally identifying with that something. For instance, when watching a movie or TV show, it is natural to identify with one of the characters on the screen. Similarly, parents often identify with their children, living vicariously through the successes of their offspring. As the illustration shows, identification ignores distinctions between me and other people, or between present me and future me, by pretending that we is me. This personal identification is verbally described by the overgeneralization that we are one. Mysticism can be defined simply as a combination of overgeneralization and identification. Overgeneralization is used to come up with some sweeping statement such as all is one, and then personal identity identifies emotionally with this sweeping statement. The end result is a concept of God, because a general theory is being applied to personal identity. This is illustrated by the joke in which Buddha orders a hot dog by telling the vendor to make me one with everything. Mysticism plays a central role in some religions such as Buddhism and Hinduism. However, mysticism is present in almost all common religions, and in the average mind, mysticism is often regarded as the hallmark of religion. Some forms of mysticism start with overgeneralization and then add identification. This is illustrated by the picture, in which the woman thinks about nature and the universe, and then places personal identity within this overgeneralization. Mysticism can also start with identification and then add overgeneralization. For instance, in this picture, the person is opening up personal identity and then allowing overgeneralization to fill the emotional void. Because mysticism is based in overgeneralization, facts must be eliminated. When one is dealing with a limited overgeneralization such as girls don't climb trees, then only a few facts involving girls and trees have to be eliminated. However, when overgeneralization leaps from personal identity to the entire universe, then all facts have to be eliminated. This can be done by shutting down perceiver thought, the part of the mind that deals with facts. For instance, Zen Buddhism teaches mysticism through the Zen koan, which is a paradoxical statement such as, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" The goal is to continue focusing upon paradoxical statements until perceiver thought gives up trying to make sense of these statements. When this happens, then teacher thought will be free to overgeneralize, leading to the mystical feeling of being one with the universe. Personal identification also requires the suspension of factual knowledge. When I pretend that I am some other person, for instance, then I am ignoring all of the facts that distinguish me from that other person. Like overgeneralization, identification also occurs naturally in the childish mind, as illustrated by this picture of a little boy pretending to be a superhero. Similarly, the mystic who identifies with a theory of overgeneralization is ignoring all of the facts that distinguish finite humanity from infinite deity. This suppression of factual knowledge for the sake of emotional pleasure is known as the suspension of disbelief, a phrase originally coined by the poet Coleridge back in 1817. Looking at this more generally, mysticism concludes that reality is merely an illusion. Of course, anyone who really acted as if reality was merely an illusion would not live very long. For instance, the imaginary cars of reality tend to destroy one's imaginary body when one plays on imaginary freeways. Therefore, the mystic usually adds that reality is a persistent illusion. The ultimate goal is to ignore facts about reality sufficiently to be able to overgeneralize that all is one, while accepting facts about reality sufficiently to be able to survive living in a world of unforgiving, solid objects. Mysticism also refers frequently to mystery and paradox. If something is a mystery, then it is impossible to learn any facts about this something, leaving teacher thought free to overgeneralize. Similarly, a paradox means that if one attempts to determine facts about some situation, then one will fail, again leaving teacher thought free to overgeneralize. I should emphasize that I am not really saying anything new about mysticism. Instead, I am merely coming up with a cognitive explanation for what well-accepted experts have concluded about mysticism. For instance, William James described these same principles in a famous book on mysticism written over 100 years ago. Quoting from his book, "This overcoming of all the usual barriers between individual and the absolute is the great mystic achievement. In mystic states, we both become one with the absolute, and we become aware of our oneness. This is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. In Hinduism, in Neoplatonism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Whitmanism, we find the same recurring note, so that there is about mystical utterances an eternal unanimity which ought to make a critic stop and think, and which brings it about that the mystic classics have, as has been said, neither birthday nor native land." Summarizing, James says that mysticism combines personal identification with overgeneralization. This can be achieved by overcoming facts that act as a barrier to separate specific from universal. Because mysticism avoids content, it is independent of both culture and religious doctrine. These simple principles can be found in many different kinds of mysticism, making it possible to come up with a simple general theory about the nature of mysticism. This means that mysticism is faced with several basic dilemmas. On the one hand, mysticism cannot survive rational analysis, because analysis comes up with facts, and facts by their very nature limit overgeneralization. Notice that the problem is not with using the wrong kind of analysis, or with using analysis to come up with the wrong conclusions. Instead, the problem lies in the very fact that one is doing analysis. On the other hand, as William James and many others have pointed out, one notices that the same basic principles keep reappearing in various forms of mysticism. The end result is that mystical analysis inevitably concludes that one cannot discover mysticism through analysis. For instance, one common statement in mysticism is that words are like fingers pointing at the moon, that are only capable of pointing the religious seeker in the direction of mysticism. That brings us to a second fundamental dilemma of mysticism. On the one hand, the very process of assigning meanings to words will limit overgeneralization. This means that merely talking about mysticism makes it more difficult to practice mysticism, because talking uses words, words have meanings, meanings imply facts, and facts limit overgeneralization. It also means that a religious person or group will naturally discover mysticism whenever religious words lose precise definitions and turn into vague words with emotional connotations. But on the other hand, emotion also leads to motivation. Therefore, the emotion present within a general theory of oneness will drive a person to think, talk, and write about this theory. This motivation will occur even when the theory specifically says that words cannot be used to describe the theory. The end result is that the mystic is emotionally driven to talk and write about a subject about which nothing can be said. The mystic typically gets around this problem by describing mysticism using words and phrases that sound very educated and very complicated, or by quoting and comparing many esteemed authors who talk about mysticism. However, if one parses these words and looks for the ultimate conclusion, one finds that the mystic is using complicated language to say that nothing can be said. This does not mean that everything that the mystic says is meaningless. Mystics have come up with many meaningful observations. But these meaningful statements are still placed within an overall package of meaninglessness. Let us make some conclusions. From a pragmatic perspective, mysticism works. If one follows the steps that are recommended by mystics, then one will achieve a feeling of unity with God or with the cosmos. As this book cover from one website suggests, there are emotional benefits to pursuing mystical oneness. However, mysticism does not just say that one experiences the feeling of being one with the cosmos. Instead, mysticism asserts that this personal experience reflects the nature of the real God. Mentally speaking, mysticism can only pursue overgeneralization by suppressing facts. But mysticism does not just say that understanding is filled with paradox and mystery. Instead, mysticism also asserts that God is filled with paradox and mystery. This, too, is a form of overgeneralization, because the mystic is jumping from personal experience to universal statements about the nature of God. I mentioned in the previous video that emotional experiences can overwhelm perceiver thought into knowing what is true. This is the mechanism behind blind faith, which believes a set of facts to be true because of the potent emotions associated with these facts. William James describes this jump from mystical feeling to mystical knowing. Quote, "Although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seem to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect." End quote. This sense of knowing gives the mystic this certainty that his mystical experience actually describes universal truth. But does this belief actually correspond to reality? Does evidence support the mystic's belief that the personal feeling of being one with God reflects the nature of the real God? Physical evidence does not support the belief of the mystic, because the physical universe is a realm of facts and content, and the mystic can only have a mystical experience by turning his back upon the physical universe and asserting that physical reality is ultimately illusion. Similarly, mysticism also contradicts logic and common sense, because the mystic can only have a mystical experience by letting go of logic and common sense. Turning to the realm of the internal, mysticism is supported by subjective experience. As I mentioned, if one follows the steps prescribed by mysticism, one will experience the emotional results predicted by mysticism. The mind produces these emotional benefits because of the structure of the mind. Programming the mind in a certain manner will lead to certain emotional results. But the mystic is programming the mind in a manner that disables part of the mind in order to take advantage of a glitch in the structure of the mind. The feeling of mysticism does not come from developing the mind in a wholesome manner, but rather from programming the mind in a manner that is deliberately incomplete. In other words, the only evidence that mysticism has is forged evidence. It asserts that the real God is incomprehensible based upon a sense of knowing that comes from tricking the mind. It is fairly obvious that what I am suggesting contradicts the opinions of many esteemed scholars, including revered church fathers and even founders of religions. But these ancient experts have been proven inadequate in most other areas. It was commonly accepted that the universe was composed of celestial spheres, which one could encounter by going beyond the edge of the earth. We now know that this is false. If the ancient experts have been proven wrong in their assertions about the physical cosmos, then why should we trust their assertions about the metaphysical cosmos? If appealing to human authority is the only way to support the existence of a God of mysticism, then one is dealing with blind faith and not with rigorous thought or academic scholarship. This contradicts the essence of academic thought, which claims to go beyond blind appeal to authority. I am not suggesting that all expertise needs to be questioned. Rather, I am pointing out that human authority provides secondary evidence. If what the experts say contradicts how things work, then how things work takes precedence over the words of the experts, especially if these experts have been proven wrong in other areas. One final point before we continue. There may be no rational basis for mysticism, but mysticism does fulfill an essential emotional need by acting as an emotional crutch. That is because the human mind requires the emotional support of some kind of general theory. Overgeneralization may lead to an inadequate understanding, but that is better than having no understanding. Therefore, if one is to declare that mysticism is inadequate, then one must provide a better alternative. I have discovered that the theory of mental symmetry can provide a better alternative because it has been used successfully to develop a rational, systematic theology of Christianity as well as a philosophy of science. And this rational alternative is described in the book Natural Cognitive Theology. I also keep finding that, unlike most ancient experts, the words of the Bible continue to make sense in the light of an understanding of how the mind works. For instance, the next video will analyze the second half of the book of Revelation in the light of how the mind works, and show that it makes sense as a description of God replacing mysticism with a better alternative. In summary, there is extensive evidence to support the cognitive benefits of practicing mysticism, but evidence does not support the idea that what is happening within the mind of the mystic reflects the nature of either God or reality. I know that modern physics is discovering that reality is rather strange, but the strangeness of physics still makes mathematical sense, while the mystery of mysticism makes no sense at all. We have looked at overgeneralization. Overgeneralization needs to be distinguished from generalization. Both overgeneralization and generalization come up with general theories, but the method that is used is quite different. Overgeneralization makes sweeping statements, peppered liberally with adjectives such as all, always, every, infinite, and eternal. Generalization makes hypotheses that are more limited in scope. Instead of explaining everything, a hypothesis tries to explain a specific set of facts or experiences. Overgeneralization cannot add specific details to its sweeping statements, but is forced to remain at the level of vague generalities. Generalization, in contrast, adds specific details to its general statements. Overgeneralization uses a form of thinking that could be described as proof by example, leaping directly from some specific experience to universal statement. Generalization jumps, but it does not leap. It starts with a collection of facts rather than some specific experience, and then attempts to come up with a general theory that can explain these facts. Overgeneralization is limited by facts. It is opposed to all facts, and not just facts that contradict the theory. That is because overgeneralization is based in a form of thinking that does not use facts. Generalization, in contrast, appreciates facts. It tries to confirm its theories by supporting them with facts. In addition, facts can extend the theories of generalization by pointing out similar situations where the theory also applies. For instance, the theory of mental symmetry began as a system of cognitive styles based in Romans 12 spiritual gifts, but it was discovered that this same theory could also be used to analyze topics such as theology. Overgeneralization asserts that it is not possible to know, and it insists upon mystery and paradox. Overgeneralization is characterized by a distinct lack of curiosity. Instead, it is attracted to words and experiences that show the limitations of facts and the presence of paradox. For instance, overgeneralization is attracted to stories of miracles that appear to violate natural laws, and it likes the idea of quantum mechanics because it sounds paradoxical. Generalization is curious and wants to learn more. It recognizes that it is building hypotheses upon a limited collection of facts and wants to refine these theories by learning more. Instead of asserting that knowledge is impossible, it asks to be taught. Finally, overgeneralization exudes an aura of total certainty. Its goal is not to build understanding upon knowledge, but rather to believe with certainty in order to achieve the feeling that comes from having a universal theory. In contrast, generalization is never totally certain, but rather must always be satisfied with partial certainty. It also wishes to have a universal understanding, but is wary of committing itself emotionally to some attractive theory that proves later on to be inaccurate. In conclusion, overgeneralization cannot coexist with generalization because they treat facts in an incompatible manner. Overgeneralization by its very nature is threatened by facts, while generalization by its very nature is built upon facts. Overgeneralization rejects facts. Generalization requires facts. One cannot simultaneously reject and accept facts. Overgeneralization forms general theories by rejecting facts. However, Western civilization has been transformed by the general theories of science, which are based upon facts. It is easy to assert that the world is a mystery when one does not understand natural law, and it makes sense to suggest that personal salvation is found in regarding the world as illusion when one is surrounded by human suffering and misery. But we now know that the natural world is not a mystery, but rather can be explained by the rational laws of nature. And we have also discovered that technology, which is based in the laws of nature, can be used to minimize human suffering. As a result, a modified form of mysticism is required that is capable of coexisting with science and technology. Martin Buber describes this kind of modified mysticism in the book I and Thou, written in 1923. Buber was a Jewish philosopher who grew up in Germany and escaped to Jerusalem in 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II. Buber points out that the rational understanding of science and the gadgets of technology are both limited to the impersonal realm of the objective, and that impersonal theories and gadgets do not satisfy the subjective needs of people. This is an accurate assessment of Western civilization, because science and technology have transformed the physical world, but not people. Buber's solution is for science to coexist with mysticism. Science, with its rational theories, governs the impersonal realm of objects and things, while mysticism, with its overgeneralization, governs the personal realm of relation and identity. Buber states that the objective realm of science is separated from the subjective realm of mysticism by an irreconcilable split. This is also an accurate observation, because fact-based science cannot be reconciled with fact-denying mysticism. Buber suggests that the healthy mind does not remain in either mysticism or science, but rather moves continually between what he calls the I-it realm of scientific thought and the I-thou realm of personal interaction. Buber emphasizes that these two realms cannot be reconciled. Instead, all that one can do is move between one and the other. Behind these two realms lies the mystical God, which he calls the eternal thou. This God, according to Buber, is utterly separate from the objective realm of I-it. But it is possible to gain occasional glimpses of God in the I-thou realm of personal relation. This happens when a personal encounter becomes so all-encompassing that one loses track of time and space. This personal encounter then, in the words of Buber, expands to fill the whole universe. Notice the characteristic qualities of mysticism, because Buber is combining personal identification with overgeneralization. And he suppresses a knowledge of facts in order to jump directly from personal experience to universal theory. At a personal level, Buber's system uses mysticism to fill the emotional void that is left by the objective thinking of science and technology. But Buber's mystical God must also coexist at an abstract level with the rational theories of science. The solution is to state that God is beyond logic and more general than the rational theories of science, as illustrated by the crown. Remember that teacher emotion comes from generality. The more general a theory, the better it feels. Therefore, a universal theory of overgeneralization will not be threatened by the rational theories of science if the theory of overgeneralization is more general than the theories of science. That is why modern mysticism asserts that God is beyond logic. But how does modern mysticism know that God is beyond logic? By the sense of knowing that comes from overgeneralizing. And as long as science remains objective and ignores the personal and the spiritual, then no rational facts will get in the way of this overgeneralization. Mysticism will say that all is one, and science will respond by saying, we do not talk about that, leaving mysticism free to continue saying that all is one. However, the examples that mystics provide of mystical thought directly contradict the assertion that mysticism is beyond logic. Buber gives three main examples of mystical thought in his book, which are typical of the examples that one finds in mystical literature. Buber suggests that the thinking of the young child illustrates the mindset of mysticism, because the child is not yet troubled by adult knowledge and rational thinking. Buber also suggests that the thinking of the primitive native illustrates mystical thought, because the native does not think in terms of rational cause and effect, but rather is immersed within the experiences of nature, moving from one personal encounter to another without trying to tie these various experiences together in a rational manner. Both the child and the native go through life in a way that is half asleep. And this example of being half asleep shows up often in mystical literature. That is the third example. Quoting from Buber, like primitive man, the child lives between sleep and sleep. A great part of his waking hours is also sleep in the flash and counterflash of meeting. But how can mysticism be beyond the rational thinking of science if mysticism is epitomized by the child who has not yet been taught how to think rationally, and by the primitive native who has no concept of rational thought? Being beyond rational thought is not the same as lacking rational thought, because being beyond implies that one knows rational thought, while lacking implies that one does not know rational thought. One cannot simultaneously know and not know how to think. Of course, mysticism has no problem with this paradox, because paradoxes prove that one should not use rational analysis. But because Buber is attempting to combine mysticism with science, he does use rational thought to look at the logical implications of believing in a God of mysticism. And these conclusions are consistent with what was mentioned earlier in this video. These conclusions are rather striking, and so we will quote directly from I and Thou. Buber says that when one encounters a God of mysticism, then, quote, meaning is assured. Nothing can any longer be meaningless. The question about the meaning of life is no longer there. But if it were there, it would not have to be answered. You do not know how to exhibit and define the meaning of life. You have no formula or a picture for it, and yet it has more certitude for you than the perception of your senses. This describes what happens when overgeneralization leads to a mystical experience. There is a feeling of meaning, and this feeling is potent enough to lead to a sense of knowing that is stronger than facts about physical reality. However, it is not possible to add any factual content to this feeling of meaning. Quoting further from Buber, "The mystery has remained what it was. It has become present to us, and in its presentness has proclaimed itself to us as salvation. We have known it, but we acquire no knowledge from it which might lessen or moderate its mysteriousness. We have come near to God, but not nearer to unveiling being or solving its riddle. This is the eternal revelation that is present here and now. I know of no revelation and believe in none whose primal phenomena is not precisely this. I do not believe in a self-naming of God, a self-definition of God before men." In other words, God reveals emptiness to humanity, but the emotion associated with encountering this emptiness leads to a strong sense of knowing. Logically speaking, this is a paradox, but it makes sense from a cognitive perspective. Combining overgeneralization with identification creates the feeling of encountering God personally, and this feeling is strong enough to overwhelm perceiver thought into knowing that this experience defines truth. But both overgeneralization and identification require the absence of factual content. Notice also that Buber defines salvation as God doing and saying nothing, repeating the first part of the quote. "The mystery has remained what it was. It has become present to us, and in its presentness has proclaimed itself to us as salvation. We have known it, but we acquire no knowledge from it which might lessen or moderate its mysteriousness." Salvation can be defined as taking a person from their present location to someplace better. According to Buber, knowing nothing through overgeneralization is better than living within the physical realm of facts and objects, and thus qualifies as salvation. Finally, Buber defined moral goodness as committing oneself to something with one's whole being. I mentioned in the second video that when a theory turns into a mental network, it will use emotional pressure to impose its structure upon the mind. Thus, a concept of God will naturally lead to a strong sense of morality, as it uses emotional pressure to impose its character upon personal identity. But what is the inherent content of a God of mysticism? Such a God pursues wholeness in a manner that ignores content. Thus, Buber defined moral goodness as pursuing wholeness, which is a good definition, but he was unable to add any specific content to his vague platitudes of living with one's whole being. In essence, a God of mysticism imposes amorality by emphasizing vague concepts of unity while suppressing specific moral truth. Buber was unable to add specific content to his vague moral statements, even when faced with the annihilation of his fellow Jews in the Holocaust. Summarizing, mysticism can coexist with rational thought if one believes with one's whole being that overgeneralization is beyond rational thought. But if one succeeds in doing so, then one will also believe with one's whole being that God is beyond personal suffering, and one will have no answer to the problem of evil. It is also possible for mysticism to coexist with Christianity. This too is a basic contradiction because the fundamental assumption of mysticism is that one cannot know factual content about God, while the fundamental assumption of Christianity is that Jesus is the incarnation of God who revealed factual content about God. I mentioned that overgeneralization occurs naturally when factual knowledge is limited. Similarly, mysticism is most prominent in Orthodox Christianity. the branch of Christianity that claims to have faithfully preserved the earliest form of Christianity. One of the fundamental doctrines of Orthodox Christianity is known as apophatic theology, which is a technical way of saying that one can say what God is not, but one cannot say what God is. The inherent contradiction of using many fancy words to say that one cannot say anything about God is illustrated by this book cover, taken at random off the internet. The title of the book indicates that it will talk about what cannot be said, while the subtitle indicates that it will look at various ways in which experts in philosophy, religion, and literature and the arts have used words to say that one cannot say anything about God. And this is just volume 1, which examines how people throughout history have said that we cannot say anything about God. And the author has added a set of critical essays written in academic language that use modern technical language to analyze how people throughout history have used fancy words to say that one cannot say anything about God. Buber modified mysticism to say that rational thought exists alongside personal experience. But he also insisted that the overgeneralization of mysticism goes beyond the content of rational thinking. Similarly, Orthodox Christianity acknowledges that the Bible does say something about God, but it also insists that one must interpret Scripture using the mystical approach practiced by approved church fathers, and not use what it calls the heretical rational thinking of Western theologians. Going further, Orthodox Christianity says that the ultimate goal is not to become morally upright or mentally whole, but rather to become a God through what is called theosis, by becoming unified with the energies of God. Orthodox Christianity recognizes that finite humans living in a world of facts and objects are separated by an unbridgeable barrier from the infinite God of mysticism, who is beyond all knowledge and content. However, Orthodox thinking concludes that if Jesus could do the impossible and become both God and man, then humans can also do the impossible and become man and God. Notice how the basic mindset is still that of mysticism, but this mysticism has been modified in order to include Christian doctrines. However, this Christian doctrine is not permitted to change the underlying mindset of mysticism. Evangelical Christianity also combines mysticism with rational thought. But instead of using rational thought to modify mysticism, evangelical Christianity uses mysticism to fill in the void where rational thought cannot reach. Evangelical Christianity states that God is revealed through the content of the Bible and the life of Jesus, and most evangelical Christians believe that rational thought should be used to analyze the Bible and follow the example of Jesus. However, when it comes to the more fundamental question of the nature of God, then rational thought is replaced with a question mark, because the typical Christian feels that the nature of God is ultimately incomprehensible. One could refer to this as a donut of rationality, with a donut of rational content surrounding a hole of generalization. Everyone knows that peripheral topics within the donut need to be analyzed using rational thought. Likewise, everyone knows that central topics within the whole should be regarded as incomprehensible mystery. The boundary between donut and whole can be determined by attempting to discuss religion rationally, because the conversation will inevitably hit an emotional brick wall where discussion cannot go further. The size of the donut varies between individuals and Christian denominations. Similarly, if one compares the typical donut of today with the typical donut of 50 years ago, one notices that the whole today is much smaller than it used to be because of the development of science and technology. Topics that used to be regarded as undiscussable are now discussed rationally. I should emphasize that we are not looking here at whether the donut tastes good or whether it is healthy to eat, but rather at the more basic question of where the donut stops and the whole begins. Similarly, we are not looking here at whether rational thought is coming up with valid conclusions, but rather examining the transition point where rational thought stops and mysticism starts. I should also emphasize that the transition between whole and donut is emotionally backed up by core mental networks. Therefore, it will feel wrong at a deep gut level to interact with a person whose whole of holiness does not match my donut whole of holiness. Going further, I have discovered repeatedly that the theory of mental symmetry feels deeply wrong to the average person, because mental symmetry suggests that there is only donut and no whole. Buber suggested that one can gain a glimpse of the God of mysticism when one enters fully into personal relation. Similarly, the typical charismatic evangelical Christian feels that one can gain a glimpse of the transcendent God when one enters fully into praise and worship. Generally speaking, the goal of praise and worship is not to learn about God or glorify God, but rather to have a personal, emotional encounter with God. One of the byproducts is a schizophrenic approach to morality. On the one hand, the evangelical Christian believes that God has revealed universal laws of morality through biblical passages such as the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount. This moral content comes from the rational donut. But on the other hand, the Christian also feels at a deep level that God loves everyone unconditionally, and that God is ultimately beyond all moral content. In other words, the donut content teaches that God is a God of moral content, while the whole of praise and worship leads to the conclusion that encountering God magically erases the results of all moral shortcomings. We have looked at the relationship between mysticism and religion. The next video will examine Revelation 10 through 20 and see what God says about mysticism and mystery. We will finish this video by looking at the biblical connection between Lucifer and mysticism. Satan, or Lucifer, is described in 3 primary passages in the Old Testament, and the mystical idea of becoming like God plays a major role in each of these 3 passages. Isaiah 14 describes the attitude of Lucifer. The phrase, "you sit in your heart," indicates that one is dealing with personal identity. Lucifer is explicitly equating personal identity with the universal God, because he says that I will make myself like the Most High. The same attitude of equating personal identity with God can be seen in Ezekiel 28. This passage starts by talking about the king of Tyre and then expands to talk about Lucifer. The chapter opens by describing the personal attitude of the king of Tyre. Your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a god. I sit in the seat of God. However, this assertion contradicts fundamental facts of existence because, as the passage says, you are a man and not God. The same attitude can be seen in the Garden of Eden. The serpent promises Eve that her eyes will be opened, indicating a mind-expanding transcendental experience. This eye-opening experience will cause personal identity to be like God, and it will lead to a sense of knowing that transcends the content of moral facts, because the woman will know both good and evil. In conclusion, I suggest that an attitude of mysticism plays a major role in the rebellion of Satan against God. The relationship between mysticism and the temptation in the Garden of Eden is explored in more detail in an essay on Eden on the website. In brief, I suggest that the curses that God places upon the serpent, the woman, and the man all make sense as natural results of building one's mind upon a theory of overgeneralization. Thank you for watching this video. The next video will look at the second half of Revelation and how God deals with mysticism.